Hi guys and welcome. This is Jen Gaeta Siciliano, artist, memoir writer, bipolar psychiatric survivor, and your host of Not As Crazy As You Think podcast, the place that offers an alternative perspective on mental illness, highlighting creativity, non-conventional healing, and breaking on through to the other side. If you are ready for a new narrative on the mental realm that celebrates crazy and cool without penalty, then Not As Crazy As You Think is for you. My life has been so busy these last few months that I didn't get a chance to address something that occurred in March 2022, a couple months ago. And it's pretty big. They updated the DSM-5 in their latest edition, published in March 2022. And they have updated up to 70 different disorders. One of them being prolonged grief disorder. Now, I've spoken to the problem in the past where they removed the bereavement exclusion from diagnosing major depressive disorder to anybody who was experiencing grief from loss of a loved one. This was a big controversy at the time when they were doing the DSM-5 in 2013, and it still remains so today. But instead of them going in one direction, they fully went in another one and gave the long-term experience of grief its own category in the DSM. So as you can imagine, there is a wide array of controversy, not just with people who are feeling as though they are being pathologized for experiencing grief of a loved one, which is a natural and human experience, but also from the mental health community, from the professionals, people who are therapists, people who are social workers, who are grief counselors. They deal with this all the time, and they're saying, hold on. Why are we pathologizing something as natural as death? You will experience death hundreds of times before you die. If you have a long life, I'm sure you know many, many people who will die before you. This is part of life. What we should be doing is embracing this experience and really developing a set of coping skills for people who are struggling. And also kind of an outreach to those who do need help, but can easily experience help through things like therapy and social networks and peer support groups. Actually, it's a really good thing in a way that's happening at this time with all these mass shootings and in the aftermath of what we experienced in losing so many people through COVID. Let it roll out. Let people see in real time what the psychiatric institution is about. Okay, that they come together and they make these decisions and then they say, this is the way it is. This is normal. That's not normal. And they basically take it, or they basically make these decisions based on what they have seen in their practice and what they read about in these research studies. So while it seems evidence-based, there's plenty of things that are evidence-based from other people who have absolutely no input into making these decisions, which are not only going to affect the American population, but the global population, because the global population is affected by widespread use of pharmaceuticals, and it's a corporate interest. It's not something that's simply bounded within the American land. Okay. It is widespread. Why? Why do we need to go there? Okay. And say one thing is normal over something else when it comes to grief. So I just want to go through what this is pointing to, what it actually means, what the symptoms are that they're pointing to, because everybody should be fully aware moving forward that if you have a kid that's shot in school within 1 year, if you're not over it, you will be diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder if you go to a psychiatrist. Now, on the other hand, if you go to a person who doesn't subscribe to psychiatry, then you have a chance at just being looked at as a human being, okay, who's suffering through yes, a state of prolonged grief, but not in a pathological sense, not in a disordered sense, okay? This idea that there are certain ways to be when it comes to our emotions is absolutely ridiculous, and it has to stop. So let's get right to it. Firstly, I stumbled upon, and I want to mention this because he will be coming on my podcast. Hopefully next weekend, I will be publishing that episode. And he's a clinical psychologist named Roger McFillin, who is host of the Radically Genuine podcast. And he is executive director at Center for Integrated Behavioral Health. And if you check out his podcast, you could find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any podcast location. Episode 31 has the title Grief. You have 180 days to get over it. Okay. So it's pretty interesting. It blew me away. It was very open, and that's one of the things he feels is missing, that authentic conversation and communicating freely. And he and his brother discuss their experience with, losing their father who died at 50. And anyway, he points out a lot of interesting information. So I was able to really absorb that conversation before I did my own research. And it's just, what can I say? It's enough to make your skin crawl. So here we go. Check that out. Check out that podcast and listen next week because we'll be having an interview with him. So how does one get diagnosed with prolonged grief disorder? Firstly, I'd love to point out that published on June 1st, 2020 in the Archives of Psychiatry and Mental Health, the article Complicated Grief in the DSM-5, Problems and Solutions, written by Colin Murray Parks, discusses this issue. And I love this statement. It is illogical and unfair to deprive depressed people of the privileges of medical diagnosis and treatment simply because they have been bereaved. Privilege of medical diagnosis and treatment? Yeah. You get to be on mind-numbing medication. That's just great. Something that you can't get off of unless you really, really pull out of the system and do it on your own with very little help. So that's what you get from psychiatry, okay, in terms of privileges of medical diagnosis and treatment. They also say that it should be pointed out that these criteria are well supported by much careful research. Indeed, one of the reasons that DSM is respected in medical fields is just that. It is evidence-based, not the whim of individual practitioners, however senior. I don't know why they feel they have to throw that in there if that was the case, because it's not. You could read several books on the DSM, critical books, one by James Davies called Cracked, another by Gary Greenberg called The Book of Woe. I could go on and on. Just look it up. Just look up, please. Do yourself a favor and do your own research. Don't buy into everything that the system is telling you. Okay, especially when they are completely driven on profit by the pharmaceutical companies. Do you guys realize that psychiatry doesn't exist without that? There is no psychiatry without drugs. Okay, so here we go. The diagnostic criteria. Now, firstly, the death of the person, they actually started with a 6-month stretch, but they decided to change that to a year, which brought it from 7% of the people who are grieving to 4% of the grieving people would then be diagnosed. And since the death, there has to have been a grief response characterized by intense yearning or longing for the deceased person, a preoccupation with thoughts or memories on that person. And this has to be present nearly every day for at least the last month before getting diagnosed. Now, here's the clincher, though. I'm going to read these to you, and you only need to have 3 of these symptoms to be clinically pathological. Remember, there's something downright wrong with you that needs to be medicalized and treated, okay, by medical doctors with prescriptions that they are developing. 3 of these things are present, okay? One, identity disruption, which is the feeling as though part of oneself has died. Now, I was an English major in college, so one of the things I loved about reading the classics is that you got to explore these ideas, okay? And people would talk about them in poetry and their own writings in nonfiction and in fiction. And it really made you feel that you connected with something larger, which is the human experience. That's out the window in this field, okay? That doesn't count. They break everything down to a clinical term, identity disruption. Again, to me, saying that a part of you has died because someone close to you has, that's normal to me. I mean, beyond, because it's describing a feeling that is extremely particular to that kind of very distinct experience. Number 2 on the criteria is a marked sense of disbelief about the death. Normal? Yeah. Especially these poor families who are dealing with the losses of their children after all these mass shootings. Come on, guys. Come on. Wake up to the reality of being human. Number 3, avoidance of reminders that the person is dead. In a way, until you're able to face it, that's a healthy thing. You know, not really wanting to go there until you're ready to go there. Trying to manage to move forward, avoiding the reality, okay? Number 4, intense emotional pain. Anger, bitterness, sorrow related to the death. What is going on here? What is going on here? Are we getting to the point as a society where we say it's not okay to have intense emotional pain over death? I mean, why even bother having this discussion if you're not going to give people honor and privacy in these personal and private times? I just don't understand where this is appropriate. Number 5, difficulty moving on with life. For example, problems engaging with friends, pursuing interests, planning for the future. This is another thing that I experienced through my own trauma. After experiencing India and being kind of on the streets and walking around in such, overwhelming despair and fear that I could potentially not get well just within the time frame that I was there, and then possibly die myself. And then having lived when I knew so many people that were on the streets at my feet, all those untouchables, there probably were, hundreds of people dying that day. Just people I had witnessed in my surroundings because of the poverty there. I had a really hard time finding meaning, finding a reason to be happy about planning for the future, about all of those previous interests I had. And I certainly wasn't thrilled about engaging with friends because they couldn't have a conversation about something that meant so much to me. It was more like, let's go out and to the bars and have a beer. And that was continually encouraged as being normal. And I said, no, this isn't normal for me. Not after what I have experienced. And that's what we need to do. Instead of reducing everything to this normal array of symptoms or responses, look at the person. Okay, be there for the person. If you want to make a difference and you're a mental health professional, that's your job. Not looking at the person and saying, oh, well, they mentioned this and they mentioned that. And here's 3 things that fit into the criteria. And now I can deliver upon them the verdict. You are pathologically ill. And here's all your treatment options. Please, please get over yourselves. Number 6, emotional numbness. Again, you can't feel too much pain and you really shouldn't shut down the pain. There's this really little tiny area that if you fall into it, congratulations, because you are part of the normal group and you don't have to be pathologized. Number 7, feeling that life is meaningless. Number 8, intense loneliness. For example, feeling alone or detached from others. Again, normal, normal, normal. Now, it goes further and says this disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. And again, what I love is so many people that lose the death of a loved one, okay, whether it be a husband, a wife, or child, your life is broken. We go through life with plans. We go through life with to-do lists, with goal settings, right? This is all like encouraged and normal, and right? This is how we live a productive, successful life. We do things like this. Once something like that happens, you need to start over, okay? Completely over. If you have a husband who you have a business with, or, you have all these things planned where you're going away and you're taking care of elderly parents and whatever, all those things now have to be re-evaluated while the person is still living their own lives, right? The griever is still living their own life. So they have to probably still attend work or deal with other responsibilities, and they have to rebuild everything else that they have possibly been building for years. So what are we saying? Time is starting. You only have a certain amount of time to do it. And if you don't get it done within the year, you are ill. Okay? This is fucked up. Okay? And another issue is the duration of the bereavement reaction clearly exceeds expected social, cultural, or religious norms for the individual's culture and context. The individual's culture and context, I want to know whose individual culture and context we're actually emulating here, because I know darn well they hate the Italian rituals, okay? My Italian background, I mean, it's a little much at times, but you know what? It is what it is. The first year, you are expected to wear black, period, okay, as a widower. Now, after that, then you can start the process of possibly getting over it, but you're not even really expected to even begin the process until at least a year has gone by, because you have to announce to everybody how sad you are. That's part of the culture. That's part of the culture, people. And the Italian experience is highly assimilated at this point. It's not like, I mean, unless you go to Italy, and you have relatives there still. However, there are so many cultures that have their own ways of handling everything, of handling loss, of handling death. For us to say there are a certain social norms, whose norms exactly? I want to get to the heart of this, because this is where it always goes awry. Because I'm going to say it straight out, okay? It's the dead white man's views, all right, that have never been updated, that for some reason, even when women started getting into the mental health professions or into, medical schools early on, they had to subscribe to the way things were. They were not on the footing to then come up with their own theories. Okay, that wasn't the game. Part of the game was coming into the practice, doing what all the white men have done before you in power, who have told everybody what to think about emotions and repressing emotions, and who have been wrong on every count on that level. Okay, evidence-based. Talk about evidence-based. I mean, men die on the average earlier than women because they hold in their emotions, okay? And if we're going to go with the white Anglo-Saxon way of doing things, because let's face it, that's where this all comes from, okay? This approach to pushing down those emotions, being stoic in it all, okay? I'm not interested in colonial thinking anymore. I can't live like this. This is not my way. Okay. It is not my way. I am much more associated with the indigenous and the way they see life than the way this colonial bent version of normal has really just added enormous stress and uncalled for judgment of anything that doesn't fit within those normal bounds that they have created alone. And if we continue to agree to this, it is going to continue spreading like a virus, the dead white man virus. And then the last of the criterion is that the symptoms can't be explained better by another mental disorder. Okay. I'm so tired of it. I'm so tired of it. It's so sad to me. And yet, in a way, it's great that it's happening now, because the timing of this is quite brilliant, right? Because here it is now, 2022. Most people who died within 2020 those deaths were fast. They were sudden. They were not predictable. Nobody knew what was going on. And a great deal of those deaths were associated with additional agents of suffering. Specifically, they were unable to be with their loved ones and unable to say goodbye to them in person. Does everybody remember this? Or are we that numb? Okay? The fact that they couldn't say goodbye directly impacts the way their grief will be experienced. Okay? And that's coming around now. I lost my cousin, very close cousin, my closest cousin, really. It's hard to I haven't processed it. I mean, I think most people don't process these things till even beginning, usually on the anniversary of when someone dies, they might start sitting down to look at how they feel about it. I mean, for me, I dealt with it in the moment. I tried to be there for my other cousins who were struggling as much as I could. And I'm still grieving. The fact that we have experienced so many people who died of COVID, okay, suddenly, tragically, we should be thinking of new ways of approaching this newly, arising epidemic of now people with enormous grief. So many more people with grief this year, right, or last year, rather than years prior. This was just such a unexpected load of people all at once dying. You're definitely going to have enough new people who can get into the system and start paying those insurance bills and start purchasing drugs, okay, with this new prolonged grief disorder label. Okay, this is what they look at. They don't look at this idea of, okay, we're really helping people. No, they're looking at getting reimbursed. That's what it is. A lot of people in the grief and loss sector, specialists, therapists, they are vocalizing their concerns, which is great. Joseph Stern, who's a neurosurgeon and nationally recognized grief specialist, in an article on Very Well Mind website called Prolonged Grief Disorder, Understanding the Latest DSM-5 Updates, which was updated on April 7th, 2022 by Low Sticks. He mentions that to now establish a normal time frame for this process could be dangerous. Okay, he goes on and is quoted saying, critics fear that it will lead to more false positives and encourage pharmaceutical companies to jump at the opportunity to develop new medications and to convince the public that they need medical treatment to cope with the universal life experience of bereavement or mourning. This can be especially harmful because when a bereaved person is in a vulnerable state and an expert tells them they are disordered or abnormal, they may begin to mistrust themselves or their emotions. Yeah. That's what we do when we do this, okay? Some people think it's about helping. It's about, getting involved and helping and doing something for that person, giving them this treatment. What treatment? I mean, I'm going to go over the actual proposed treatment. It's a CBT therapy. It's a cognitive behavioral therapy, which honestly doesn't sound bad, but you don't need a psychiatrist for CBT, okay? Because the psychiatrist is going to give you the label. You don't need, to get a label to be treated under a therapist. You don't. You need a label to get medication. And that's what I always remind people. Don't label your kids. Don't get the label. Just get the treatment. You want treatment? Go to the therapist. Get some treatment, okay? I continue with my therapist. I have a therapist. Hello, I'm not anti-therapy, okay? I think we all need someone who can be our advocate. Sometimes it's useful to just hear yourself talk out loud and to have that allocated time to just get into it, But you have to have somebody who has a back and forth with you, who understands how you understand life, okay? Who interprets things the same on many levels. And there's so many people that you can choose if you give yourself that chance to explore all the people out there. And I'm sorry, but bottom line, I believe in abolishing psychiatry because there's no reason for it, okay? There's absolutely no reason for it. I don't believe in those medications. And I feel that I can say that because I've been strung up on medications my entire life since I was 22, and I'm still trying to get off them. So I come from an expert position on this, okay? They don't do anything except sedate you and change your cognitive functioning. Don't believe me? Well, get on them yourself then and see how you feel. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but it's really very upsetting. In that same article, clinical psychologist Noel Hunter, who specializes in trauma and grief, strongly disagrees with this new edition, saying, "This is yet another disgusting display of overreach, pharmaceutical influence, and an inability as a society to tolerate painful emotions. The updates to the DSM are sadly representative of a process that has been troubled from the start. It is abysmal and reprehensible to attempt to justify pathologizing someone for their process of grief. It is a clear attempt to provide medical justification for prescribing more antidepressants and further numb our society." Yes. Yes. And everyone should be pissed. All the clinical psychologists should be pissed. Okay? Because a lot of people who are specializing in grief and loss, they are trying. They are doing what they can. And the thing is, these things are complicated. So to reduce everything to 3 symptoms and a checklist, you know what? What do you want us to be? What do you want us to be? You want us to be repressed robots. I get it. Okay? I don't want a world like that. I don't. I want more inclusion in the compassionate realm. See, one of the problems is that we lost sight of our faith in something other than ourselves, in something other than the system of what man/womankind has created. Okay? And it's not enough. All right. If you only look into the human systems in place as your saviors, I mean, I'm not saying you need to subscribe to any kind of religion, but if you are so adamant that absolutely nothing exists than this world, you may subscribe to the psychiatric intrusion in your life, okay? Because you're going to give that a try, right? You already discounted anything that's spiritual or, outside of the realm of something that you can see through reductionist materialism. I get it. But those philosophies, even if, you believe in just materialism, there's still other ways to go about healing. Rather than reducing everything to, biology, reactions, behaviors, and drugs, okay? And behaviors that then result from the drugs with the judgment, if those behaviors change and now represent these list of behaviors, which is usually just sedated responses to life, then you're healed, right? That's a positive outcome of the medication. See, people don't understand that. People think that medication does something and then all of a sudden your life is good. And it's like, oh, I just needed to give in to the medication. Okay, you could believe that. And maybe it's true for you. So I don't want to disable your system of relief. But to push out this idea that these drugs are doing anything except changing your brain functioning so that you can then be numb, it's a lie. Whatever. It's sickening. I know that once I was diagnosed, my life ended. I was, a superstar at school. I graduated cum laude. I had double major in college. I was extremely talented in many, many areas, whether it be art, theater. I, was doing a off-Broadway show right before I went to India. I say all this. This is not a braggy thing. I say all this because my functioning was high level. When I then fell into the hands of the psychiatric institution, it became completely disabled to the point where I couldn't do anything except sit down, watch TV, and eat Snickers bars. And I'm not exaggerating, okay? I can enroll any one of my family members and they would have been convinced that it was my illness that caused all these things because that's what they were told by the doctors. This is not real, okay? This is their game. It's their narrative, and it doesn't hold any kind of long-term truth, and it won't hold any long-term truth in our society, okay? We could go back to antiquity and look at all of the different pieces of literature, whether it be, Greek drama or the story of the Hebrews or, whatever you want to look at and say, wow, these have lasted throughout time with, long-lasting morals and tales and revelations about the human experience and the human spirit and our interaction with something other than ourselves and so on and so forth. That will not be the case for psychiatry, okay? I declare that their system will fall. It must fall. Because it has nothing except a few people with white coats who are making these decisions. If so many people are upset with this in the mental health industry, why wasn't this more of a vote? Why wasn't this more of a vote? Getting a psychiatric diagnosis changes your life, and it's not always for the better. And once it's done, it's done. But in this article, Archives of Psychiatry and Mental Health, I mentioned before, Complicated Grief and the DSM-5 Problems and Solutions, this is what they state in response to that. Far from being upset by a psychiatric diagnosis, they and their families are reassured that they have a known condition for which treatment is possible and that they are not going psychotic or going mad. I love that. That's the true, fuck you to anybody who's experienced psychosis. Okay, what they call psychosis, which many of us don't see in that way. Okay, so yeah, I get it. We're the worst of the worst, the bipolars and the schizzes. I get it. I read this stuff constantly, and it's just sickening. Continuing. In my view, the privileges of diagnosis and treatment usually outweigh the stigma that faces all psychiatric diagnosis. Illness can also evoke sympathy, and families are less likely to reject or judge sufferers for being weak or dependent than they are at present. It's just sickening that this is the writing that they come across, okay? They're setting up the situation so that people won't judge them as being weak. Why not teach people to be compassionate? Okay, not just give them a diagnosis. Give the sufferers a diagnosis so that everybody can deal with them. And this, again, is why my relationship with my parents, that, during this time, it's getting a little better. I can say that. But for many, many years, it was destroyed because of what they put into my parents' brains. And so they always walked away with this notion that they had to deal with me. They also had this problem that they had to deal with. Screw you. Deal with. You are dealing with me now because I was so debilitated on those medications. That's what my parents came home with. Okay, not a person who was dealing with just her trauma, but a person who now was disabled because of the meds that they gave me because of my trauma, that they didn't even ever label as trauma. So it's a completely useless system if you are looking to it to solve social problems. And then they go on to say, doctors, too, are more likely to take an interest in the patient and in the many areas in which no adequate services for bereaved people exist to ensure that they are introduced. Again, now doctors can deal with us, right? Because they have a category that they could look through. It's a lens. The only lens that they have is the DSM. That's how they look at their patients. And if they don't have a DSM label, well, maybe we could force you into another mental diagnosis label, and then I'll treat you. Why? Because that's how they are reimbursed by the insurance companies. Okay? You have to understand how the system works in order for you to understand why it continues going down this road. Because the system continually sustains itself. Okay, so let's talk about people who are more naturally at risk. Okay? Some individuals may be at greater risk of developing prolonged grief disorder. And this is from a statement on the American Psychiatric Association website. And those are people who are older adults. I wonder why. Because they're dealing with death. And you know what? Let me explain something. I'm 50 years old, okay? And as time has gone by, as a young person, I always feared getting older, as many people would. But now that I'm on the older side and beginning my older years, I love it. I embrace it. I say, oh my gosh, like with this age comes security. With this age comes conviction in my principles, in my ideas, in my beliefs, in my own life. The conviction that I am an expert in my life, not these medical professionals. It took a long time for me to get there. But it took also me having the strength and courage to reject every single one of these things that they thought about me. And they will continue to think about me. And if something should happen to me in the future that is a mental state of distress, they will point to the fact that they had labeled me when I was 22 and that it is just a relapse of that state. They will point to this. They will continue to look at me until the day I die as a person with this disorder so that they can sustain their own sense of worth, right? As a person working in those fields. If you don't feel good about what you do, then why do it? And this is the really upsetting part. The risk for prolonged grief is also greater when the death of the loved one happens very suddenly or under traumatic circumstances. Okay. Again, Uvalde, the mass shooting in Texas. Come on. You're going to revisit these people in a year and tell me that if they didn't get over it, they have a mental disorder? Well, you know what? I don't want to live in this world. And I had said that before a few times on the inside when they were giving me like all this nonsense about what I should think about myself. And I remember saying that a few times to people. That doesn't mean I'm suicidal. It just means I won't have it. Okay. And if I have to do everything I can to make sure that this world changes because I'm in this world and I still have a chance to do something, then that's what I mean. I'm going to do it. Okay. I can change the world just by changing my attitude within it. I'm not accepting this. Okay. Now, they say that evidence-based treatments are available. And it involves, they say that there's really no medications that are appropriate right now. They don't seem to work. Many that have been used for depression. Another article from Harvard Medicine Magazine in autumn 2021, before this was official, has a title, The Profound Sadness of Prolonged Grief by Amanda Luden. Okay, and they mention that in older adults, prolonged grief can affect as many as a quarter of those suffering a loss, according to a 2011 study, while a 2014 study in the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry, or JAMA Psychiatry, stated that about 9% of bereaved older women, defined as women over the age of 65, experience prolonged grief. Relationship to the deceased, in particular, if it was a child or a spouse, was more predictive of the condition. Get that. Predictive of a mental disorder condition. Predictive. I don't even know what to say. I mean, can everybody who is a human being admit that if you lose a child or you lose a spouse, you're probably going to grieve more than if you hear about the loss of a friend who you haven't seen in 25 years. I mean, that's normal. See, there has to be some kind of normal movement, right? Normal, increasing the idea of normal, increasing the group of people that stand for normalcy so that we can say that things that are considered abnormal today in this stupid book are really normal things. And let's all celebrate the variety and the diversity of all these different states of normal, because normal for you is different than normal for me, is different than everyone else. But where the danger lies is that this is normal for so many people. And who are these experts saying that it's not? So the New York Times covered this in an article written on March 18th, 2022 called How Long Should It Take to Grieve? Psychiatry has come up with an answer by Ellen Barry. And Dr. Paul Applebaum, who was chair of the steering committee overseeing the revisions to the 5th edition of the DSM, makes a statement. They were the widows who wore black for the rest of their lives, who withdrew from social contacts and lived the rest of their lives in memory of the husband or wife who they had lost. They were the parents who never got over it, and that was how we talked about them. Colloquially, we would say they never got over the loss of that child. Okay, so again, what are we saying? What are we encouraging? This is treatment? This is help? This is assistance to those who suffer? No, it's judgment. Okay? It's judgment. And there is nothing more repelling to healing than judgment. Okay? And I know this as a fact. And again, people are still in the field coming out with it. Joanne Cacciatore, an associate professor of social work at Arizona State University, who's published widely on grief and who operates the Sela Care Farm, a retreat for bereaved people, stated, I completely, utterly disagree that grief is a mental illness. When someone who is a quote-unquote expert tells us we are disordered and we are feeling very vulnerable and feeling overwhelmed, we no longer trust ourselves and our emotions. To me, that is an incredibly dangerous move and short-sighted. Exactly. Because anything in your life that causes you to grow is eventually looked upon as being a positive. I mean, I know it's a hard concept for many of us who go through it, but trust me, I understand it. You know, having had the trauma that I had, being completely alone in a hotel room, feeling like that I was dying, not knowing if I could get home. Again, no phones, no internet, nothing like that then. I didn't know what to think or do, but I started doing a lot of these weird, kind of strange rituals. During the time, it wasn't strange, but it was life affirming. I was packing and unpacking and packing and rearranging, and by doing that, as I waited for my cabbie to help me get to my emergency flight home, I was sending, I guess, energy out there, showing that I had enough faith and hope that maybe I could get home. That if I did get home, there would be a life afterwards that I could prepare for, right? And giving all these gifts away to people. And that's what I was doing. I was repacking and rearranging all of these things I had bought for people. And in doing that, I was sending out intentions. And that was the only thing that kept me going that night. Okay? Stayed up all night hoping and praying that this cabbie would show up. All right. And he did at 6:00 in the morning the next day to take me to my flight. And it was just so traumatizing that later on in life, I found myself in the midst of performing this packing ritual again. And I went through it, and it was a process. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, I'm going to go through this. I am going to full out go through this. It's seizing upon me. And this was years later, decades later. And I remember one night, and I was just repeating over and over the same words that I was using in that hotel room when I was 22 years old. And by the end of the night, after, acting this out and going through this emotional catharsis, I realized I finally got over it. I finally worked through this. And it was because I didn't have any restraints on me. So many times we are just seconds away from the miracle. So many times. And we don't allow the process of healing because we're so interested in stopping the pain. Didn't we learn anything from the opioid crisis where, it's all about managing the pain and killing the pain, and then everybody became addicts, okay? In this case, people don't like to use the word addict, but that's what we end up becoming. Not that we crave the medication, but that we cannot get off it safely without serious withdrawal symptoms. And these withdrawal symptoms could permanently change your brain function. There can be permanent damage. So why? If you have a choice to go to just a regular therapist or a psychiatrist, why would you choose a psychiatrist so that you could get this diagnosis? As Jerome C. Wakefield in this same article, in this New York Times article, who's a professor of social work at New York University, stated, you've got to understand that clinicians want diagnoses so they can categorize people coming through the door and get reimbursement. That is a huge pressure on the DSM. This was originally going to be identified at a 6-month mark after a bereavement, okay? But apparently there was a lot of begging and pleading to define the syndrome more conservatively, which would be then a year, okay? Just to avoid public backlash, though, okay? Which then brought it down from 7% of the people that would have been affected to 4%, which is, I guess, a big decrease for the pharmaceutical pool of future consumers. So back in 2016, there was data from clinical trials by Dr. M. Catherine Shear, a psychiatry professor at Columbia University, who developed a 16-week program of psychotherapy that drew heavily on exposure techniques used for victims of trauma. And she had good results for patients suffering from intense grief. And it even outperformed antidepressants and other depression therapies. And apparently the results were promising. On average, 70% of patients found relief from their grief. So I guess I just want to make a mention to this because they are still working out drug trials, okay? There are options. There are options to go through the pain rather than go on drugs and get medicated and numbed, okay? And it's not a bad plan for healing. So, but any therapist can help you through this. Any therapist. You don't need a psychiatrist. And I really want to stress this. So in general, their treatment protocol focuses on helping people accept the reality of the loss and restore their capacity for well-being. Okay, in 7 main areas, which is accepting grief, managing emotions, envisioning a positive future, strengthening relationships, narrating the story of the death, living with reminders, and connecting with memories. So they meet weekly with their therapist and are given activities between sessions. They tape record some of the things, and they work out long-term goal setting and invite a family member or friend to a session, and they could visit places that help grief triggering reminders of their loss. So there's nothing wrong with this. This is developing mental health treatment and out of compassion. So fine, but you don't need a label. You don't need a label for that. All you need to do is go to your therapist and talk about how sad you are because someone passed away a year ago. All right? They don't need to give you a label for that. And then that would be advancement. Calling upon compassionate, caring interventions would be a positive, okay? We don't need to go to drugs, but they are going to drugs because that's how the DSM works. The labels are first created, and I'm not just saying this. I've done tons of reading, and I could give you an enormous amount of resources. I just listed 2 books in this podcast alone, okay? This is not me just saying this. That's how it's done. The DSM first comes up with the disorder, then they go for drug trials, okay? You can't do drug trials without the disorder label. That would be unethical. I want to mention that there are other ways to cope with grief, even if you're not religious or, you can't connect to that feeling that maybe one day you'll see that person again. I come from a background that I had rejected, I have integrated my traditions in some capacity to make it make sense for me. So I don't reject it now. I just don't practice as a visiting churchgoer every week to, a Catholic church. But I have a lot of respect for much of what they teach. And also from what many people in mediumship teach, okay, people who can connect with the other side, people who are shamans, this is my way. Everyone has their own way, okay? Everyone has to connect in their own way to whatever makes sense in this world, okay, to give it a deeper meaning. But they would have you not give meaning to these things, okay? The only meaning that they want is to say that you have a mental disorder, okay? And then point to, oh, here's the criterion for it. It's ridiculous. Okay, last thing I want to say is that the New York Times ended up putting out a bunch of letters under the title Prolonged Grief, a Mental Disorder or a Natural Process on April 2nd, 2022. I want to just read some of these quotes because you should know what other people who have seriously considered what this means as either a mental health professional or someone who is grieving a loss, okay? People have written their letters, and I want to just mention a few of these quotes. By Joseph Truman in Hackensack, New Jersey, he writes, referring to his wife dying 6 years back, I return to an empty house, sleep alone in an empty bed, and prepare meals to dine alone on an empty table. These are existential facts, and that I should feel the pain of her absence is not a mental disorder, but a reality that will remain with me for the rest of my life. The cliche that everyone grieves in his or her own way is assuredly true. That the psychiatric establishment has now pathologized prolonged grief is not only stigmatizing, but also imperious. When they develop a pill that will bring my wife back, I will reconsider my position. A letter by Gail Lerner from Los Angeles states, I fear that labeling any type of grief as a mental disorder will bolster the notion that it's an illness best left to be treated exclusively by professionals. When my 2 teenagers were killed by a drunken driver in June 2019, the most essential and enduring source of my resilience came from the friends, family, and clergy who rallied around me to listen, cry, share memories of my children, and say their names. Although I still pine, yearn, and often long to withdraw from the world, all symptoms of prolonged grief, their ongoing support is what gives me the strength to get out of bed, go to work, even have fun. While therapy and medication have their place, there is no better treatment for grief than community and conversation. It takes a village to raise a child. It also takes a village to mourn one. From Charles Schwartz in New York. Unfortunately, each new DSM diagnosis opens up the floodgates for a new group of suffering people to treatment with psychiatric medications. As an internist psychiatrist with 30 years of experience treating end-of-life patients and their families, I've witnessed psychiatry reducing to viewing all human suffering as a set of pathological disorders or diagnoses that must be treated with drugs, fallaciously touted as curing everything. Make no mistake, medical treatment means only one thing: drug treatment. From Martha Weinman Lear from New York, who is an author of Heart Sounds, The Story of a Love and Loss. I've had grief longer than a year, have interviewed scores of people in grief, and have written about grief. And what strikes me as abnormal is not grief prolonged beyond the APA's 1-year prescription, but the degree of chutzpah required, professional training notwithstanding, to presume to set timelines for the normal grief of others, which in fact is as various as the grievers themselves. By Peter Hunsberger in Seattle. I've specialized in grief over the past 40 years as a practicing psychologist. The best way to help with prolonged grief is the opposite, to honor these feelings and explore what purpose is served by them in the client's psychological system in order to find other, better coping strategies. And from Benjamin Sadok from New York, a writer who is a professor of psychiatry at the New York University Grossman School of Medicine. As a psychiatrist who has practiced for over 50 years, I have seen countless numbers of grieving patients. Some grieve for an hour, some for a lifetime. For all, it is the price they pay for having loved the one they lost. You know what? Love is the answer, okay? Holding space for people who grieve during terrible tragedies and regular loss, that is the answer. Calling someone a mental case for such feelings is not the answer. And this time, there are more people who are coming forward with these criticisms. Please do your own research. Learn how they do things. Okay? Learn how the DSM is created, how these labels are created, why, and what are the steps next. The next steps are the medications, and they're already in progress. And once those medications are offered as treatments, those CBT therapies are just going to be something in the past, because they're going to say it's a 16-week process, and that's too long of a process for me, right? Too long. You might as well just take a pill. But we can start new ideas, okay? We can start a new movement towards compassion and towards holding space for others. It's possible. And really, it's our only hope for change. Thanks for listening to Not As Crazy As You Think, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And remember, mental health is attainable for anyone, especially those labeled with mental illness. Until next time, peace out.